you?
Good. Good to see you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, to a relatively small group. We had a lot of people asking whether we are going to record this. We are recording this, so it'll be visible for you to circulate to your family and friends. The topic is very timely given the peace agreement that we seem to be having in Afghanistan, and the general sense among a lot of the media that, you know, a lot of years, a lot of blood, a lot of treasure in Afghanistan hasn't really produced very much. We have a case here. Our chairman, Professor Starr, who needs no introduction to this group, has assembled in this paper not so much any policy prescriptions for the U.S. government, but more of a situation review of what is really happening in Afghanistan, how is the country really doing. And without further ado, I will let you elaborate on this subject and hope we can have a fruitful discussion about it. And perhaps the issue of what the policy implications are is something we could have in our discussion, unless you plan to address that directly.
I don't. Let me say first what this isn't about. This isn't about the negotiations, it's not about the agreement or non-agreement, it's not even about the elections. It is about information. And the information to characterize the information on Afghanistan today, you have to understand that the single most authoritative source right now on how is it doing are the reports of my friend John Sopko, who is the inspector and has a staff of very capable people, and they publish annually a big fat report, which is, depending on which year you focus on, gloomy or gloomier. And why? Because their job is to see how are U.S. programs being carried out. They are, in that sense, auditors. They determine whether they are being carried out efficiently and effectively, and they have found, as you know, fault with a good deal of the execution of those programs. I won't pause on one obvious point, namely a point which Ashraf Ghani made in 2002 when he was Minister of Finance. Namely, he said, you do much better if you channel this aid through the government rather than around the government. What you do by going around the government is to promote a culture of corruption. Whereas if you went through the government, you could have some chance of influencing the correctness of your project. But that's an aside. Those reports, which I respect, are the main source of information on how we're doing in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, they only deal with a corner of the subject. 80% of the information covered in the reports of the Inspector General pertains to military related. And that's the huge overwhelming percentage of the aid. And then if you go beyond that, you find another big chunk is devoted to drug interdiction and things like that. So this really, that what we think of normally as development assistance is a rather small part of those reports. And yet those reports stand for everything that we're doing in the country, and B, they have been allowed to stand for the country itself. The equivalent, it's a kind of narcissistic quality about not just the reports, but our relationship to them, in that we think that we're the only subject. This is the only thing going on in Afghanistan, which is not the case. There are many other aid programs and assistance programs by other countries, some of them quite interesting, by the way, others not. There is a lot of activity going on in Afghanistan in the development heading that falls under Afghan organizations themselves. And finally, very significantly, you have Afghan businesses which are increasingly playing a serious role in the economy. None of these are covered in the report. So these are not reports on Afghanistan. They are reports on us. That's the key thing I want to stress at the beginning. So on this basis, let me ask, well, are there other sources of information? Well, by and large, no. And I want to say bluntly at the beginning that while I consider the coverage of Afghanistan by the American and Western and world press to be a disgrace, to be an absolute miserable job, that said, I would like also to acknowledge that they have faced very formidable difficulties in covering the country. The first of which is financial. It costs money to send someone to Afghanistan for a week or even a couple of days. You send them there, the whole process of going and coming is not simple. And if they go there, my goodness, to whom do you turn for help? What about a translator? Because no one going there practically knows any local language. These are serious impediments. The budgetary one is enormous. The staffing one is serious too. What do you do if you're only there, therefore, for 2-3 days? Of course, you arrive with your story in hand. If you don't arrive with your story in hand, you're not going to be able to use those 2 or 3 days effectively because really what you need to be doing is making contact with people who can give you lines that you can quote in your text. You're fleshing out the story there. You're not seeking the story. The last thing that most newspapers and journals have is the capacity today to send someone there to ask, what's the story? What's going on? That kind of general reportage just isn't taking place. I remember as a New Orleanian watching very closely the coverage of Katrina, and I commiserated with more than one major reporter, especially the New York Times, guys who were there for 24 hours. If they didn't have their story when they arrived, and they had one cliche after another, they weren't able to flesh it out and file it by the time they got back on the planes. Same problem in Afghanistan, but much worse. So the press has been useless in this. And of course, there are notable exceptions, I acknowledge them, but they're by and large useless. So my effort here has been, I do this as a kind of, pursued this as a kind of hobby. I've just collected scraps of information as I've come across them. And once I started doing it, a number of friends started feeding me scraps, and then their friends started feeding them scraps. So I have a file probably of 30 pages in close print of more stuff like what you see before you. Not all of it is rosy, needless to say. Some of it is pretty grim, as any coverage of anything in any country in the world would be. So what I did in this was simply skimmed off the things that were closest to the top of that pile and pulled them together and issued them as what I call a briefing paper. Now, what does it show? It shows at the very beginning, it started at the very beginning. Even the question of security, as it's being covered, is not accurate. As of today, the Taliban controls not one provincial capital. Not one provincial capital. And furthermore, yes, it is true that they are able to make raids on 3 or 4 score capitals and control dozens themselves. But that's out of secondary towns, district centers. There are 400 district centers. So even if they controlled 75 of them, which some have claimed, and that may be the case, at least for certain parts of the day or night, even if they controlled 75, it's a very small part of the whole. and it's not the provincial capitals. And furthermore, it's worth noting that the geography, Afghanistan's a big country, even if you don't iron it out. It's a big country, and if you look, where are the district capitals which they control? Overwhelmingly in the south. And it's overwhelmingly in the southwest. The southwest of Afghanistan, if you go down around Helmand and the Helmand River Valley, which, by the way, the U.S. 2 generations ago developed fantastically. And if you have a few minutes, read the reports of the U.S. Commission on the Helmand River irrigation projects. It's quite astounding. But now that's all reverted to desert. So the south and southwest of Afghanistan is like, it's like Arizona without Phoenix. And to say that they control a vast territory down there isn't to say much. That's what I want to stress. So even the interpretation of the military data presents some challenges which we're not acknowledging, let alone meeting. Going beyond that, the question is what's going on in a whole series of areas of life, which I think are worth our pausing on. But before turning to them, let me categorize the sources that I draw on as I collect this stuff. This is my 30-page single-space total. First, the international financial institutions. They're doing some serious work. Some of it is some of their findings are thoroughly depressing. Others are definitely not. And there are a lot of these organizations. Dennis Dutrey has been a perpetrator of this for generations and knows the quality of the stuff. It's very high. It's as close to authoritative information as exists. It's very good. And they all cover different corners of the story. So you can't just go to the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank or the Islamic Development Bank or the EBRD or you name it and expect to get the story. You have to just skim through all of them and see what they have to say. Second is the second major source is the government of Afghanistan itself. I have good friends within the government who have been very generous in providing me with information. This is really astonishing stuff. What I include in my briefing paper, for example, on the electrification process. This is hugely important. I have to say the Afghan government has done a miserable job of communicating it, even those things that it's done well. How many people realize that how many provinces have gained electricity for the first time in their history, and what a dramatic thing this development is, especially if you consider that survey after survey of Afghan entrepreneurs say the biggest impediment to their success is lack of access to electricity. This is just one of many areas where actually the Afghan government has done some very credible work. And shame on all of us for not knowing this. It certainly presents a different side of life than we hear regularly. And in many other areas, communications, transportation. Mr. Qayumi, who was the former president of a college in the California system, Afghan, and who is a senior guy in the government on economic development, reports very interestingly on the expansion of airline contacts in the country. It's amazing, really. I mean, Herat, Kabul, you got to these places in the past by going to Herat or Mazar-e Sharif or Kandahar. You got to them only by going to Kabul. And then you went out from there. Now you can get to them for all of those cities and from quite a few world capitals. Their planes are not flying empty. They may be today, I don't know. But, but in general, they've not been flying empty. And both Afghans going out, business people, and other people coming in. By the way, this is not drug trafficking. This is normal business, and that's another point I will come to in a minute. third major source is the U.S. government itself. Actually, we forget that the Pentagon for years had an office that was focused on economic development there, on business development. The records of that office still exist. They're quite accessible, and the people associated with it are around. There are other offices of the U.S. government doing work in the development area that keep data. These data don't get out, and they are yet another source. And finally, I have to say that there are personal contacts that are important. In my case, I know quite a few Afghans I've met over the years that I'm, say, in regular touch with. Some of them are associated with the business community, and I've been astonished, frankly, to learn of the progress of the business communities, especially in two cities of Herat and of Mazar-i-Sharif. I can tell you that the leadership of the business community in Mazar-i-Sharif are young people who are as modern as anyone in the region, anywhere else in Central Asia or the Caucasus. These are very, very competent young people, and they're doing it right. There's a different business culture arising among them as opposed to their great uncles and so forth. Then finally, I want to tip my hat to the Rumsfeld program, not just because David Sabadze just walked in the room, but who is the chief operator of this remarkable program. But the Rumsfeld Fellowships, which we, the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and the Rumsfeld Foundation together, put together 11 years ago, have brought dozens and dozens of Afghans to this country, young Afghan people on the rise in the business and other communities, male and female, and we keep in touch with many of them. And many of them are at the heart of in the thick of things there, and they provide very, very impressive and interesting data from time to time. And they do it in the same spirit that I do, namely, if you come across something interesting and unexpected, put it down. So there are various sources. That's what I want to stress, and they are out there. It's possible to stay abreast of all of this. Now, what are the areas that you want to follow if you're going to get a fuller picture, of what else is happening in Afghanistan? Well, I think one, the obvious one, it has to be in the economic area. The economic situation is not good. There's no secret about that. But there's a new and interesting element of caution in reports that have gone on for 20 years about inevitable and persistent capital outflow. Well, you know, if all the capital that is said to have flown out over these years was in fact flowing, there is a heck of a lot of capital in Afghanistan. Or if there isn't, they're running on empty today, which isn't the case. There's capital moving out. There's also capital moving in. Frankly, we don't know. Anyone who claims to know capital inflows and outflows to Afghanistan is blowing smoke, because it just isn't one of those things that is accessible to the public. That said, there's a lot of information on the economy as a whole. There are a lot of new firms, a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. We know some of these people. They're very impressive by any world standard. They're operating normal businesses. They are consciously separating themselves from the business culture of their uncles and grandfathers and parents. Because they know there are the limits of that culture. I'm not saying they're pure as driven snow, but I'm saying that they are acutely conscious of what you cannot do by the old methods. And that's a reality. Now, what's important about the business culture is that it extends to so many important areas of communication, transportation, services, basic services, and as a result, life has changed. Life has changed. At the very time you have one of the most massive urbanizations taking place anywhere in the world, you have the fastest growing telecommunication for over a decade. This was the fastest growing market for cell phones in the world. And and that combined with urbanization has put everyone in touch with everyone. And the numbers of Afghans who haven't been to a city of any size is minuscule today compared to any time in the past. And they're running in and out of Kabul on a daily basis, which is good or bad, become a mega city. Now, beyond that, there is, of course, the role of women in the economy, but that's been one subject that we tend to touch upon, at least episodically, in the press here. It's a reality. It's not just a fantasy. That's real. And that leads naturally to the bigger question of social change in the country. You would think we were dealing with a static Afghanistan if you read just what we cover about the military situation. It's by no means static, and I wouldn't claim to have the data on everything going on, and I don't think anyone does. However, what we do know, besides massive change in urbanization, the demographic processes are beginning to show now in terms of the famous demographic curve, high birth, high death to low birth, low death. They've moved along that noticeably in the last generation. Every measure of health is up. These are really quite striking. It's quite amazing to see. Of course, all of this is starting from a very, very low beginning point, but every major health indicator is way up. And beyond that, the educational data, you've seen a lot of that. That does get published from time to time. But what I want to stress about the education is that penetrates quite deep. You can't get the participation rates by age that they have without getting out of the big cities. And this is quite notable. It's under threat, as has been pointed out more than once. And many a school that was opened is closed, and others that closed and reopened. But the educational achievement is very significant, and it is linked with a dramatic shift in careers, and the careers people are choosing to follow. There are literally hundreds of careers that didn't exist 20 years ago that do exist today, and people are getting qualified in them. And if you go to Kabul, for example, drive down the street, and now they have it looks like a Pakistani or Indian city with signs all the way up to 5-story buildings of advertising constantly. It's really kind of awful, and these are often brand new buildings, by the way. But you look at those signs and you'll be astonished how many of them are advertising training programs. So the educational data that we have, which is itself inadequate, incomplete, and often out of date, has to be supplemented with all the for-profit training schools, academies, institutes. I assume a high percentage of them are really bad or ineffective, but there they are, and they reflect a society undergoing a really fundamental transformation. I think that's quite striking. I would say beyond that there is, I hesitate to stress this too much, there is a real generational change taking place in all sorts of institutions. the educational is, Kabul University has some very competent people, I have to tell you. There's some very, very bright, decent, solid, and folks teaching at Kabul University, but they're the young crop of people coming up teaching everywhere is very impressive. I have to put in a word here about the American University of Afghanistan, which deserts 10 times more support than it's getting, both public and private. But they too have a wonderful, have been able to attract a wonderful group of younger teachers who some of whom have really endured very terrible afflictions while there, and there are a couple who are still undergoing that, so captives. But the the generational change is real, and it's real. It's true also among the Taliban. We can't think of the Taliban as the same crew as formerly. The motivation is different. I mean, they're facing a different hiring situation than they did in the past. To the extent that there are new economic opportunities that didn't exist in the past, people are presented with a choice. And that causes, that very dynamic within the society, in turn, creates a certain distance between the guys in the bench level, Taliban people, and those fellows sitting in Doha and places like that, living very nicely, thank you. That's a different world. But the generational change at the upper levels of the Taliban it has to be noted. I'm no expert on this. There's a lot of information available about it. And I bring it up because it reflects the general change that is generational and demographic in the country as a whole. Finally, I want to say something about culture and psychology. This is the hardest thing to pin down in any neat, tidy, quantitative way. But it's not the same country as 20 years ago. It is a very different place. It is a place that in which really thousands and thousands and thousands of young men and women have been out of the country. They've looked around. When you're the first time going from there to, let's say, to India, it makes an impression. I'm not speaking about walking down Fifth Avenue in New York or Beijing. But thousands have been around. And if they haven't themselves, their brother or cousin did, and they've heard about that and seen pictures on the cell phones. That's one thing. The windows have been opened very decisively. And the psychology is very different. It's got to be. It's if you meet an Afghan for the first time, ask them immediately about their family. Everyone will tell you a dramatic and interesting story that speaks to cultural and psychological shifts that are taking place and that have gone very far in a very short period of time. I've been trying to collect information on YouTube all over the region. What are the folks, the young folks in Afghanistan putting on YouTube and taking off YouTube? I only have 3 or 4 people who've given me really authoritative stuff on it, but I mean, you just can't believe it. It looks like, it's just hard to find a bridge between that and what we read in the paper. And I'm not suggesting that the distance is any greater than it would be here, but it's quite striking. The overall expectations obviously have changed in the country. The idea of normal life has taken on an entirely different meaning than it did for a generation ago when we showed up there. Okay, this is a very quick all I've done is flag some of the topics that one might consider in an effort to gain a fuller picture of what's going on in Afghanistan today. What does this add up to? Well, first of all, it seems to me, whatever we do with regard to our future, we shouldn't be shy about claiming a certain role in everything I've talked about. You can assign us a certain role in many negatives too, but it seems to me for us to deny that some of these developments that I've described have taken place, or that we have played, or to claim that we have played no role in them, is really not very smart. I would go beyond that though and say, look at these as an investment. And you know, one might reasonably ask, who invests $1 trillion in anything and walks away from it? This is not my image of a smart investor. Usually, if you invest billions in something and walk away from it, there's got to be someone else who will walk in and take over the asset and develop it further, even if you've decided not to. What that means, I'm not going to venture a comment on. Finally, though, I think it's worth asking, okay, what happens afterwards? It seems to me that this has become a country much more desirable to have good relationship with and a hand in than it was in 2001. Much more. I'm not even talking about the INOC copper, which the Chinese gave up and which is still there to be developed, and all the other mineral assets, which are huge, but I'm also speaking about human resources and as a market which one never thought of earlier, but it's becoming one, or going to become one. It seems to me that these factors, looking into the future, should inform policy. Otherwise, we're just making policy by driving down the road, watching the rearview mirror. That's not very smart, it seems to me. Now, if this is the kind of country that's emerging, if it were dramatically to go south, which is, some people have argued actually is happening now due to general uncertainty, or others have argued that it will happen. If that were to be the case, who would feel the effect of it? Well, I'll tell you who would. Pakistan would. They know how to, they've already dealt with the chaos in Afghanistan. The Iranians have too. The drug issue hit them, the emigre issue hit them very hard, and they've largely recovered, significantly recovered from it. The people who would be really hit by this would be first Central Asia, all of Central Asia. And don't kid yourself. A dramatic downturn in Afghanistan we know that this produces emigration today. That's the way the world is. Where will you emigrate to? Well, you might want to go to the Gulf, although they're sending some people home. However, Central Asia looks awfully good because you already speak their language. In Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. So Central Asia would be hit very hard. And if that were to happen, and I presume the United States would not accept responsibility for that, the only people who would benefit from it would be the big northern neighbors and possibly China, which would step in a security role. So these are all issues that are at stake. I'm not suggesting a particular course of action. I'm just suggesting that it's prudent to keep all the variables in mind when you try to define or solve an equation.
Thank you very much. We have ample time for a discussion. We have very qualified people here. We'll start with you, sir. Just identify yourself.
Tom Timberg has been following these matters for a number of years, and in fact, I ran a project out of Peshawar, looking at the Afghan economy in the late 80s and 90s, on sort of the basis that you're raising, which is we were employed by USID with a directive that no American citizen could cross the Afghan border. So we employed Germans, Indians, mostly Afghans, Pakistanis, to do all the actual research, and sat in Peshawar and hoped they told us the truth.
What was that weird hotel there?
Well, that there was, but we were.
Dean's Hotel.
Yes!
Dean's, oh, yeah.
Well, you mean the what? The one that had the bar? Yeah, it was the only one in Pakistan at one point. But in any case,
Pakistani gin.
indeed.
From Murray.
In any case, I had a short comment and then a specific and a general question. The short comment is that Afghanistan has thankfully survived for 1,000 years with relatively ineffective government, and we hope will survive for some more, even if it does continue to have relatively ineffective government. It seems to me that a lot of the processes you're describing are simply a healthy society which somehow adjusts, and government which adjusts to the weaknesses it faces. Specific question. There's a lot of study of illumination and using aerial photographs as an index of economic activity, and it connects very nicely to electricity. Have you looked at it? Actually, I haven't checked, but I know where I can check. I'm pretty sure there's fairly good data that's on Afghanistan. If you haven't used it, I'll send you the reference.
I haven't used it. I've been in touch with a guy in Germany who's poring over this stuff at night. It sounds very intriguing.
The leading person for this has been a Professor Brown, and there's a succession.
Please send me that.
Okay, good. Anyway,
the German says
what?
His conclusion is very noticeable.
Okay, and I would think it would be. I'm just okay. Now, the much more general question is, despite all the optimism, which I'm happy that you're giving us, there are two historical, if you will, precedents that scare people a bit. One is actually what happened in 1993 when the United States decided essentially to pull out of Afghanistan on the assumption that it wasn't accomplishing anything. And the answer was a power vacuum appeared, out of which came Al-Qaeda and True Lebanon, etc. So no country as prosperous as the United States probably can be comfortable with significant areas of the world which are really empty and open to all people, Somalia, Yemen, etc. So I'm wondering if that isn't a more general concern. And then we do have the preference that this is our preference. Everybody here thinks about China in 1949, maybe Vietnam in 64, 65. We thought we had regimes that we could work with, etc., and could survive, and they turned out they couldn't. Would you have some arguments or indicators that Afghanistan is safely not in the Chiang Kai-shek or Dien, the various and sundry people who ran Vietnam? That is, that they are, and they're good historic reasons. I mean, both these countries had hundreds of years of background. The Vietnamese had a anti-imperialist legitimacy and so forth.
Well, on that, I would just say that they're deal makers, and since the mid-18th century, they've made deals that have worked internally. I think the point that I would make about it is we have an impact on that. And it seems to me the recent elections, which were judged very flawed, that was the wrong way to evaluate them. The only question that counts, it seems to me, for us, should have been, was this election better or worse than the one preceding it? And I've asked a lot of people whose judgment I respect. I wouldn't be able to answer that question myself, but I've asked people there and what they thought, and they all said, well, yes, it was bad, but it was better than the one that preceded it. On that basis, it seems to me the United States should have recognized this, announced, flawed but better than previous, and there on that basis we recognize the results. But instead we've hung around for how long was it, holding everyone up in the air, inviting dual power, and now dual inaugurations and so on, which is entirely our doing, it seems to me, quite unnecessary. You know, until we stop doing things as ham-handedly as that, it's hard to answer your question.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Phil Carrara. I'm one of your biggest fans. Two questions. One, what is the status of the drug trade in Afghanistan now? Second question, could you comment briefly on the activities of China, Russia, and Iran in Afghanistan?
Well, the drug trade, it continues. On the other hand, its roots are changing, and I gather it is feeling the same impact of everything else, and that is the desire to do more of the processing in country rather than send the product abroad to be processed is growing. On the other hand, I've been told by people who are on the spot, especially in Herat and Mazar-e-Sharif, and one guy from Kandahar, that it's not, that the geography of it has changed. It's it continues to be focused in the most backward places where people don't see alternatives. Now, I don't trust the measures of its scale today. 10 years ago it was, I think, measurable, more nearly measurable than it is today. There's a big diversification in that field, as you know, and it does not favor long-term viability for anyone producing it in the raw as opposed to doing it in the laboratory.
China, Russia, and Iran.
Well, you know, first, China, I think they have shown impressive caution there. They really got their fingers burnt in Anak, and you know, they got their fingers burnt initially in Gwadar as well, when those Chinese guys got murdered by some ruffians who we concluded were political operatives who were driving for a weekend of boozing, I suppose, in Islamabad, and they were driving up from Gwadar, and the Chinese went crazy over that. I think they've been rather restrained in the hope that in the long run the U.S. will do the dirty work and they'll wait till the time is right. It's surprising how little Afghanistan figures in their Belt and Road project. Russia is a different story. There is a new Russian Cultural Center in Kabul, and I haven't seen it for a couple of years, but when I did, I went and had a nice talk with the guy running it, and this is it shows they haven't forgotten. We are in a period where many veterans of the Russian-Afghan war are writing their memoirs. And I have one good friend, Russian, who's done this himself, and he says it's a whole industry. And it's very much, if you will, picking this old scab. And I think the effect of this generational group reminiscence is actually to inspire some of the good old boys in across Russia to go settle some scores, not only with them but with us, because after all, Charlie Wilson did exist, and they know it. And by the way, love and film, that's another matter. Now Iran. There's been a lot of anxiety about Iran. My impression is that Iran is actually less engaged than may at first appear. Of course, they have tremendous amount of trade and interaction with the whole Herat area in the west. That's natural and it's inevitable. It always has been. It's Khorasan after all. It's all single region. But and one has to acknowledge that the Iranians built one of the two dueling mosques in downtown Kabul. I haven't read a word about this, but here you have the Saudis and the Iranians building these enormous institutions, which they call colleges or universities, right in the center on two hills in Kabul, and you can't not see them. And in many places you can see them both. Iran is not indifferent to it, but I think in this case one has to assume that what they're really doing is countering what they see as an equally aggressive move by the Gulf states, especially the Saudis. Yeah.
Yeah, I assume the Iranians built a Shia mosque?
Yeah, of course. And one other thing about Iran, and that is, you know, well, you saw who got hit the other week by ISIS, and that was the Hazaras. And I think there is a kind of across Central Asia, however cordial their relations might be with Iran, and you have to expect good relations in a country where the official language is the same as in Tehran. And books, for example, the easiest way to get a book translated into Dari is to steal the Farsi translation or adapt it a slight little bit. So you expect the good relations. On the other hand, there is a real cultural gap between Central Asia, Iranians, they're Persian-speaking Central Asians, whether they're in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Iran, or Afghanistan, and Iran on the Shia issue. And also, they rather resent the Iranians making such a thing as, you know, speaking about Tehran, to use Ferdowsi's term, as really Eastern Iran. It isn't. It has its own specifics, Khorasan, and it has for 3,000 years, and everyone knows that. Therefore, there's a certain point beyond which Iran cannot go in either Afghanistan or Central Asia as a whole.
Fred, although you didn't want to talk about the war and the questions of providing physical security, that is, of course, an elephant in the room. And the question then becomes, if the United States lives up to the terms of the agreement, which mandate the pulling out of American forces, I believe, within 14 months, can the Afghanistan government, I'm talking about Ghani's government, of course, Abdullah's I think is not going to go anywhere, but can the Afghan government, one, maintain security in the country, and second, can it be reconstituted to include members of the Taliban and move forward? Or would that be the basis for subversion of the state? Or some other analogous term?
Well, the non-recognition of the government, that delay, invited the Taliban to open up a divide and conquer policy with vis-a-vis the polity of Afghanistan. It invited them to negotiate separately. And we don't know. I mean, whether that happens above board or behind the scene, it's hard to imagine that it won't happen now. And that's a real downer, it seems to me. That's a dangerous development. And we created it. Now, on the further issue of security, I read the statement that they have made and about what kind of government they would want, and I noticed very carefully in every such statement, the Taliban say we want a normal, peaceful Islamic government. Now that's the working word in that phrase is the Islamic. And it's interesting that there was the compromise over the name of the country at the time of the Bonn conference, that it would be the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, but its laws and its courts are not Islamic. They are Roman law, basically. And so I think if given the opportunity soon, as is not unlikely, I think they'll probably behave pretty badly. Or very carefully and very strategically start picking off topics, and you know what they would be. That said, to go back to the one Taliban achievement that should be in the history books, and that is coming up with absolutely the best marketing phrase that anyone came up with in that era, when they said, "You have the watches and we have the time." I've been saying that dated from around 2002, but it turns out that it's much older than that. By the way, it dates back another 15 years. But I'm not sure that that is true today. And I think everything I was reporting, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of my 30 pages single-space notes on what seems to be going on in the country. If even half of that is true, it is creating a situation in which the Taliban becomes less and less relevant. It becomes less and less an option for the unemployed in the countryside, and so on. So it may be that, I'm not offering this as a statement, but as a hypothesis that should be tested. It may be that time is now on the side of change. I don't mean to minimize the seriousness of the Taliban threat today, and the military threat, the security issues, Steve, that you speak of, but I think there may have been a kind of big shift that is taking place. If that is so, it has profound implications, and since I can't tell if that is true or not, and an absolute judgment on that is impossible, nonetheless, it seems to me there is enough evidence that time is no longer decisively on the side of the Taliban, that we should be, and given these dynamics I've spoken about in the economy and the society and then the culture and so on, and governmental institutions, which I didn't even touch upon, that we should view every hour on the clock in which there's not a crisis as a victory, and that these add up. And if that's the case, it calls for a very different approach from across the river in the Pentagon than we're getting. Yes, sir.
My name's Mike Alvin. I'm an independent researcher. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to your comments about sources and SIGAR and SALCO and so forth. First of all, SALCO's outfit is not DOD. SALCO's, it's congressional, it's independent. So
But it
reporting-
inevitably,
Yes, I understand your point. The, the access to information that SACO provides for the defense or security sector is conspicuously missing, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody here, from equivalent outfits in Department of State and USAID. It's very difficult to extract audit reports or any kind of reports, field, USAID field reports. I'm not talking about classified state stuff, but it's, please counsel me on where I can find this on the net or through my congressman and so forth.
I wish I could. Look, it's embarrassing that someone who is casually collecting fragments of information, which I shared with you as a briefing paper, that this could be so, appear to be so dancing out of line. This is all readily accessible stuff out there, it's just that no one's collecting it, no one's utilizing it, no one's writing about it. Is this the job of state? It certainly is the job of USAID to evaluate what they have done, but even if they do a wonderful job of evaluating, that's only part of the deal.
Indeed.
Do you know every province in Afghanistan is going to have a German vocational training center? That's serious. You know, that wouldn't appear in our reports. There's a lot, the Indians are doing all sorts of initiative there too, some of it very constructive.
Well, this is research on all of these matters, econ and education and communications and business development and so forth. It's a matter of picking up sticks one at a time.
Yes,
and I don't expect it to be an encyclopedia.
But let me add another possible source of this information that's let us down, and that is the Afghan government itself.
Yes, indeed, and there's been a journalist strike along those lines within the last 2 or 3 weeks. They've been out on the street bellyaching about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important. The information, this is a frontier area, and anyone who wants to make a serious impact immediately should be out collecting this information and sharing it publicly.
Indeed, thank you. But you haven't found any magic entree, a magic URL into
No.
reporting or
No, but
Accounting officer.
just nosing around. I can't claim to be any more systematic than that.
Thank you.
But I've been given a whole slew of websites that I check, and some of them, but others, you know, I've asked a whole bunch of people there to please pass on information that they think would be useful, and they do it. So it's not difficult to get this stuff.
Another difficulty with regard to economic development or any kind of development, your own institute's student programs, fellowships and so forth, is getting people out of the embassies into the field. How is that being managed?
It's not, and the Afghans haven't helped, because I mean, I am an enthusiastic fan of the Chambers of Commerce of Afghanistan. And in the last half year or so, I write in the timing, they have been centralized. There is now a single national chamber of commerce, and all the local, is that correct? Yeah, and all the local branches have been subordinated to it. But this is an obvious source of information. We have attachés. I don't think. Look, getting out is, people are afraid to, even though there are, you know, there are tourist hotels in Bamiyan today, you know, and I think we're frankly starting to believe our own gloom, and it becomes self-fulfilling for us, not necessarily for others.
Are others doing it well? Are the Germans doing it well?
No, but
are the Brits doing it well?
People are going, you know, and they're holding conferences, and people go, You know, the Hurrah
Herat is
security
busted.
conference is, people go to it, it's not any big mystery. There are cultural conferences, I was involved with one in Kabul just a while ago. I am, again, where am I coming from in this? You used the term at the beginning of, or one of your, optimism. I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist either. I would like to think that what I'm presenting is kind of a clinician's report. You know, if a clinician fails to see, notices that there's something in the pancreas, but fails to note that the heart is functioning very well, thank you, that's not a good clinician. And I'm just trying to round out the clinician's report. I think the obvious, if you add up the pluses and that country has, I think it's not an exaggeration to say it still, or maybe more so even than recently, has the potential in the 21st century to do what South Korea did in the 20th century.
My goodness, if that is an optimistic guy.
Well, I'm presenting this as a hypothesis. I'm not presenting it as some naive, this is going to happen. Why? In 1955, South Korea didn't exist as a state. There was no identity. The border wasn't clear. Where will the capital be? Afghanistan has had a state, and it's had a border, and it's had a capital for 300 years. Nobody in the worst civil war and multiple foreign invasions, no one wanted to secede. Think of that. That's a heck of an achievement. That says statehood is real. Therefore, the term nation building, we don't want to, you don't need to do nation building in Afghanistan, thank you. It was done 300 years ago. What we have done is support the development, modernization of society and of the economy. And seems to me, back to Korea, that they had no intelligentsia in 1955, or a very small one and not a modern one. Look at them today. They had back then no resources. They don't have any today. Very few natural resources in Korea. And their location back then was terrible because the northeast of China had not been developed, and it was not, transport all the way up there was not a plus. Look at them today. Now, Afghanistan, on every one of these counts at the present moment, is way ahead of where South Korea was in 1955. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that this inevitably will enable them to, but they do have assets. They have an intelligentsia, a very impressive group of younger, well-educated, competent people. They do have identity, national identity. They have a national capital. No one wanted to secede all those years. They do have resources. My God, they're one of the truly resource-rich countries. They have fantastic location once you stabilize the internal situation. So it seems to me it's not a fantasy to say that one of the scenarios that one might seriously consider is the South Korean scenario. And again, what bothers me is sloppy logic on our side. I'm very conscious of logic these days. I'm writing a big book on Avicenna and Biruni. They're big on logic, Aristotelian logic. What bothers me is that we're basing actions on assumptions that we don't acknowledge. And therefore, we're excluding other assumptions that may be equally logical, and other hypotheses that might be equally possible. Once you accept some of the alternative hypotheses, of which I've only given one, but once you accept that there are alternative hypotheses, you then start evaluating various claims, and you start picking and choosing among them. We haven't done that.
I have a question over here, sir.
Sorry.
Are the number of Afghan refugees in neighboring countries an indication of how well it's going in Afghanistan?
I really don't know. Of course, the Iranians were flooded at one point, and I gather they packed a lot of them back home, and a lot of them gone back home. I don't know the scale. Really don't know. Of course, the Iranians were flooded at one point, and I gather they packed a lot of them back home, and a lot of them gone back home. I don't know the scale. I don't think it's a big factor in Tajikistan or Uzbekistan.
Pakistan is where I was thinking.
But Pakistan remains, of course. I mean, my gosh, that whole border. You know, there are now deep-rooted Afghan communities along that border. But we're also talking about Pashtunistan. We're talking about Pashtuns on the Pakistani side of the border who have more in common with the Pashtuns in southeast Afghanistan than they do with the guys up in the northeast of the country, and that is a so you know, if you cross that border as a Pashtun, how much of a border are you crossing? And that has enabled those communities. My gosh, they're very developed today. They're rug makers. And it's the only place I think in the world where guys are making rugs, by the way. But that's another. These are settled business relationships now. I think the Pakistanis within the past 6 months have made several very urgent pleas to send them back home because it's costing us so much. But I can't give you an accurate assessment of that situation. It remains a big problem in Afghanistan's and Pakistan's eyes.
So, Fred, you painted a picture that things are better than we think, okay? Why didn't Ghani do better in this last election?
For the same reason that we don't have these data. Ghani's you know him very well.
Yeah, but I don't understand the statement.
This is a government which has done far less than it should
Oh, I agree, but
in communicating what it is doing.
it doesn't matter what they communicate. If things are better on the ground, they're better on the ground. You don't need to communicate that. It's either real or it's not.
The overall turnout was piss poor,
Yeah.
for both candidates.
They didn't
that's
care.
true.
Yes, that's the indifference, the overall indifference was astonishing.
I mean, I come
Well,
from
is that indifference or fear?
Well, perhaps.
Or fear, or the feeling that, hey, what's happening in this country, we're doing. It's not coming down from the government. I think that's a factor too.
But, I mean, you know from my work on counterinsurgency, that a key issue is to relink people to their governments. It's not about fighting, that doesn't win an insurgency. And if the things you have told us about from these sources are all true, I don't understand why there isn't a stronger link.
I go back to the point that you yourself have stressed over many years, more than I have, and that is our failure to work through the government.
Absolutely.
Means that an average Afghan who sees anything positive is likely not to understand that his government had a hand in it.
Oh, okay. So you think that even though there's much less, or there's less, I don't know, there's much less, sort of hands-on management of the Afghan economy under Ghani than there was before that, during the war, that the typical Afghan doesn't understand that?
No, they do and this would be worth looking. Look at the newly electrified provinces. I'd like to know how the voting came out in that. But broadly speaking, this magical term, which popped up in our consciousness in the late 80s, in the late Soviet era, and I was involved in the popping, and that is civil society. The idea that all these positive things have been created by civil society, the implication is that it was done there and not by the government. But it's paid for by foreign governments. This is a point which Putin was making years ago, and I think he had a point. It's certainly applicable in Afghanistan. I mean, by empowering societal organizations and giving them funds directly, not through or with the government. By doing that, this was a devolutionary and decentralizing and initiative on our part, and the results are what you saw.
Well, that could be CERF programs under DOD, for example.
Yeah.
But that's come under terrific criticism both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And similarly, with regard to local administration of development assistance and the role of NGOs or implementing partners or whatever you want to call them, there's a development in the literature that I've seen, and I don't follow it all that closely, that urges the decentralization, almost call it federalization of the country, so that recognized that 300-year tradition of statehood that you referred to is also a 300-year or maybe a 3,000-year tradition of local autonomy.
Yeah, I know.
And the issue is devolve development, or I put the development money in a central bank or dole it out however, but make sure it gets into the local authorities' hands. Not NGOs, but locally elected shuras or majlises or however they designate them in their respective languages, and let them have a crack at that development money. Now, these big projects like electrification, what is
That's
that?
right. He spells this out in
100%, that's just
exhausting
exactly what we did.
detail.
Year of what?
Uh,
Came out recently?
2018.
Oh, well,
It's
yeah,
yours.
good.
That really exactly focuses.
No, it would make exactly the point you're making, that we complete, that in some sense during the war, the central government couldn't do what governments need to do, but local governments could, and we proved it with the two provinces. And they did a brilliant job, and it was small amounts of money, so it wasn't worth stealing.
You can't electrify through this process.
Oh, no, it was a complement to the big ticket development, not a substitute for it.
Yep. Now, what I don't want to do at this point is to refight the Battle of Bonn.
Gotcha.
I remember Joschka Fischer after that saying, well, they should set up a federal system tomorrow. Germany didn't voluntarily think of that. On the contrary. But be that as it may, I think there are from the Bonn agreements some long-term liabilities that will require eventually adjustments. And the one we've just spoken about wasn't formalized in the Bonn agreement, but it was immediately crystallized in 2001 in American aid. I think one of the most important documents, internal documents on Afghanistan since 9/11 was Ashraf Ghani's speech at the Tokyo Development Conference, Donors Conference, in which he said, he touched on all these, and this was in 2002, I think. Were you there?
Quite a while ago.
Yeah, well, but he said it very clearly. Look, I credit Afghans with understanding how to work out these complex balances within their society. I wrote once a book on decentralization and self-government. I have a certain bias in there, But I would trust them far more than I would trust us to work out these balances. And they weren't doing the working at Bonn.
Ambassador Yakubashvili, you were first, and then Dr. Blank.
Most likely I'm one of the last, not the first, but if I would be coming on time, probably I would not be asking this question. I probably already said it, but I'm just confused. Who needs this information that you are referring to?
Who?
Yes, who is a consumer? I mean, who needs to know in that greater details what's happening in Azerbaijan? Sorry, in Afghanistan. I was just reading about Azerbaijan, that they closed the opposition office, the fear of coronavirus.
Well,
Because as I understand, one of the cables that are not for public consumption unless they end up in the WikiLeaks, this kind of information should be gathered by the embassy, by the political officers and others. Library of Congress has services, the research and analytic services that should be producing something.
the
Congressional Research Service.
Congressional Research Service, yes, that's kind of their direct job. Much of think tanks that claim to be experts on Afghanistan in this city and many other cities supposed to have papers on that sort. So what I hear is that none of them actually do that, and I'm also trying to understand who needs this information. And whenever I go and talk about Afghanistan, so we have a fatigue, or we have something else, we have corona
It's
fatigue.
about us.
Yeah. What was quite telling that whatever assessments you refer to, these are all about Americans, about how Americans are doing, how this office is doing, and etc. Not about that country, but about American institutions. So who is the consumer? Or who should be the consumer and why?
Those are two very different questions.
Yeah.
Who is, you all know. Who should be, I cannot, look, we're making huge decisions on matters involving Afghanistan. Even if we don't care about the Afghans in the country, we want to make those decisions that are prudent from the standpoint of our interests. We're not doing that because of a failure to inform ourselves. Who is failing to do the groundwork on that? Obviously, first of all, the U.S. government. Shame on them for not monitoring these sort of things. This should, but I give the international financial institutions a few points, not many, because they, in their monitoring of the whole globe, have come up with more information than most others. I think, though, that the press is inexcusably lax in this. This is, look, I'm doing other things. I'm writing a big book. I'm not doing this stuff. But with my left hand, I have these 30 pages of single-space notes, and this stuff just keeps piling up. It's there. Now, then you ask, well, who should inform the press if they're not going to be able to afford to send a bunch of guys over there, or want to, or risk it? The think tanks. This city is full of people. I mean, my goodness, you could fill a big room with people who call themselves Afghan experts. Not one of them has produced this stuff. What's going on?
There's no money in it.
That's the key.
Think tanks don't just write, we all know that. Somebody has to give them a contract to do this, and no one's giving them a contract to look at the real situation, warts and all.
Well, the organizations that have occasionally done this, but have been failing both in this aspect, and I think more generally later, are first the GAO for American government programs, but there must be some studies of aid programs and so forth in Afghanistan that they've done, but the greater potential was the independent oversight, independent review organizations of the IMF and the World Bank, and unfortunately, under my were somewhat, but now they're so guarded, and the reports are only released if they're approved by the boards of directors, that their outputs are not as searching as they should. But your point about, that's why we have presumably independent think tanks.
Yes, well, I'd add NATO, by the way.
Good job.
NATO has put a lot, this is a very controversial decision to go there. And the NATO countries should have a keen interest in evaluating the progress there. Where have they been? I don't excuse them on this at all. But I drop back. There are serious people in the Afghan government who know these things, and some are collecting them. They have their own, a couple of think tanks. I think the government of Afghanistan, we should have been bombarded with this information from the embassy over the last 25 years, and we haven't been.
This is true.
Sir at the back. Oh, sorry, Mr. Blank, you were
Okay.
first.
Okay, briefly, actually, I'm one of probably the few people who read the book on decentralization back when it came out, and I still remember it. The point is, I think here, and we made the argument that, if you don't give the money through the state, that the state atrophies as an instrument that people look up to, and you create a culture of corruption. That's critical here, because ultimately, in these, and there are going to be more situations, whether they be in Central Asia or in Africa or somewhere else, like Afghanistan. And you can see that already happening, or Venezuela, The point is that unless we are able to work out a way to enhance legitimate, that's the key word here, legitimate state capacity, the effort fails. It fails for lack of publicity, it fails for lack of results. And having talked to military commanders, everybody, the military commanders say, give us a few more men or a few more years and we can do this. As you see, from what you're saying, the Taliban has not been particularly successful militarily. Nevertheless, the media, who doesn't understand military issues and has a bias against it, has reported that you would think that they're overrunning the country.
I'll get to just one second. Very quick comment, and that is that the rise of independent communications, cell phones, et cetera, and all the independent media within Afghanistan, which, and this is real, we know some of these people, they're very good, has had the effect of shifting attention away from state institutions, I think. It may have here as well, I don't know, but it has had that effect. And interestingly, let me give a concrete example. You may recall 3 years ago, there was a big explosion in the very center of Kabul where 35 people, I think, were killed. At that time, we were having a Kamka meeting in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. I was in the swimming pool with the deputy head of the deputy mayor and the head of one of the biggest communication firms in the country when the information came in. They got on the phone immediately, the deputy mayor, very, very capable guy, and they got rolling immediately. They had the street completely cleaned up. They filled in the huge crater that the bomb had created. They'd repaired the windows on the surrounding building. The street lights were functioning. Everything was back the next morning, and people drove through there like a normal day. Now, interestingly, there was huge coverage of the explosion itself, not a peep about what happened, and yet their own top media people were were all over the case, and their top officials were. Something really went wrong in that case, and I take that there must be many, many others.
Sir at the back.
Yeah, hi. My name is Charlie Gilman. I just wanted to interject. There seemed to be in the decision about who's responsible for collecting data in development. I came because this is a development problem. I work in USAID and State Department. I'm aware of DOD's efforts to do a better job of evaluating just the exact things. You might know Jason Lyle at Yale did some very important work, I think, in Kandahar to show that actually violence went up, or the willingness to commit violence went up when they got cash transfers without improved economic opportunities, sustained economic opportunities. This is very important stuff, because I think this entire situation, we had this mantra that said, this is a poverty problem that resulted in terrorism and mass violence, right? And it's what you're getting at, but I think, I don't wanna get into that, because everybody here is probably more expert than I am with this. I'm now an evaluation scientist at the World Bank, a consultant, and so I know whose job it is to be measuring these things. Doing a development evaluation should not involve crawling through the bushes after it's over looking for data. The correct way to do it is, as it's being set up, you decide what you need to measure to answer the questions that you have at the beginning, that measure your assumptions. And so this is some of the things that thank goodness, Jason, Lyle, and others are able to come backwards and say, all right, our assumption was that if we just give them money, they'll feel less likely to commit violence in Kandahar. And he said, well, that assumption turned out to be wrong. It's not perfect information, but it's better than the total absence, the fantasy of non-information. So I know for a fact that USAID's job is to collect its data according to laws that we now have since I think 2014. They're supposed to share all of it unless it's against national security with the entire United States. All of the implementing partners, DAI is one of them. I also worked very briefly with them, and I know they had a huge Afghanistan portfolio. They share 5 of them. They are now required to share all of that data with USAID and make it publicly available. It's not happening, and it hasn't happened, and there's no pressure for it to happen. There's almost no pressure for it to happen. So you shouldn't be, anyway, my point is, do not let the organizations off the hook. The World Bank is supposed to be evaluating what it's doing. Maybe it is. Everybody gets a little better as time goes by. USAID needs to be doing theirs. They're not. State Department is. They're not. So this question about where should this be and why is it coming, who doesn't care, is actually law that many of them do these things that you don't see.
The best can be the enemy of the better. And in this situation, it seems to me, if there were 10 guys doing the kind of home cooking that I've been involved with, the situation would change. It would change with the press, it would change with key people in Congress. It would change, but they're not doing it. Or if they're doing it, it's going into squirrely reports that nobody sees. I think the place to start in this is the think tanks and the press.
So, if I were Tom Donahue, the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, what would you tell me about the opportunities for U.S. businesses in Afghanistan?
Well, what I'm trying to do, I've been working with friends at CSIS on this and the embassy. I would like to see a high-level, 25-member maximum, or maybe even less, 20-member delegation that would include, say, 8 CEOs, 8 press people, top press people, really top press people. I'd like to see them go there, spend maximum 5 days, because they don't have much time to do this sort of thing, and I would have them visit Mazar-e Sharif, I'd have them visit Herat, I'd have them then have a final afternoon in Kabul. I think if they were to sit down with their counterparts in the chambers of commerce in all 3 places, they'd be shocked. They'd be astonished. Now, let me just say, here we're sitting on our behinds, having made the investment. Whose chambers of commerce are meeting there? Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. There are regional doors that are being opened. We're the ones who made the investment. We should be seeing what opportunities this may have created. That's very simple to do. The cost will be about $350,000, including first-class airfare and protection, security.
Sir?
Yeah, is there any lesson to be learned from the most successful transformative project in modern Afghan history, and that would be the Taliban ending poppy cultivation virtually overnight.
That's fascinating. And you'll recall, for those of you who were neonates at the time, that actually this was demanded of us as a condition, as I recall, and they did it, and we sent up over two delegations, I believe, to check on their claim, and the delegations reported that they indeed had stopped the poppy cultivation. Then there arose a very interesting contretemps in American politics and communications, in which it was argued that of course they did this. They've just stockpiling and in order to drive up the price. And the lesson of that case was that they did the deal that we made with them broke down.
But was it true? Did they stop fighting?
No, there are two U.S., I think Department of Agriculture surveys concluded that they had honored their side of the deal. I'm
No,
not.
he was asking about the motivation of the Taliban.
Ah, yes.
That's a nice story, but
Yeah, exactly.
that's, anyway,
Well,
maybe
there-
true, maybe not.
There's no way of knowing what would have happened because 9/11 intervened. What we do know is that in the intervening year, cultivation up in the Northern Alliance controlled areas increased by 192%, if I remember right.
After 9/11.
No, before, because in the areas that the Taliban did not control, it immediately increased by tripled or doubled or tripled. In the Massoud controlled
Yeah,
areas
the
in the
Northern
north.
Alliance,
Yeah,
in their area they control.
yeah.
Look, if we took,
Which would suggest that there wasn't a surplus of
Right.
opium out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
the implication of everything that we've discussed for the last hour and a half is that the treatment of the phrase, the term nation building has been ghastly. That of course, as I indicated, we're not nation building because, thank you, they did that job in the 1750s. And they worked out internal deals that made it possible for them to have survived the last half century of utter turmoil and invasion and civil war without anyone wanting to opt out of the nation. What we were doing and what we should stop apologizing for doing and what we should continue to do is working with them, not on them, to build a normal, market-based, productive society. That changes the climate in which all the other issues would be resolved. We have been doing that. We've whenever asked, we devoutly deny that we're doing anything of the sort, even though, and therefore, handing ultimately the credit for all of this to someone else.
But isn't one very big issue that in the beginning we stated our goals in such a way that they could never be fulfilled? And therefore, all that you're talking about today doesn't compare to the goals that were set up in 2001 or 2 when Afghanistan was going to become a liberal democracy. Tomorrow. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly.
Well, that's right.
There's another
And by the way, I don't, again, there's a danger of narcissism here. It's not just about us. When India decided to build the new parliament building, they had very, very expansive and very laudable ambitions. Many were engaged. Yoshka Fisher's federal system, everyone was. This was in the air then, and we weren't the only ones doing it, including many Afghans.
There's also another precedence for this. I mean, if you look at what the Soviets did in Central Asia, say in the 20s and 30s, at immense cost, I mean, without denying it, they put in a program what they called state building. they were going to build quote, a socialist Soviet state. Now, they did so at immense human and probably economic cost, but they built a state to function. And the real problem here is not building nations. I agree with you. It's not only in Afghanistan, but it was true in Iraq, and so we got rid of the state. In Vietnam too, we undermined the state back in the 60s and so forth. And then we had to build it, we never understood that what is necessary is to build both the state and society. It's something that the founding fathers understood. It's a famous essay by Madison in the Federal, which basically says, first you have to build the state that can govern, and as well as the people who can, the structures, the institutions that can control it at the same time.
Let me touch on something that we haven't touched upon. I just mentioned it in only one of my notes in my briefing paper, and that is the law. The state is the law, among others. And the Afghans have done a commendable job in creating, I mean, they worked with many people, with their constitution, with the secular courts, secular laws, you know, and they've, as I indicated, how many female judges have they appointed in the last year? All this is happening. Not a peep about it. This is really important stuff. And by the way, there are a lot of American lawyers who've been involved in this stuff. They've got no intention to that, no credit. I said at the very beginning, this discussion above all is about information. Yeah, I think the cure, it's a great term, the cure. Avicenna wrote a 8-volume thing called The Cure. He saw all these problems and he said, okay, here's the cure. Boom.
Shafet.
Yes.
Shafet.
Wow. The cure in this case, the easiest, quickest way to effect a cure is through information. We have cheated ourselves by impoverishing the information available to American citizens who paid for all this.
I think on this note, there are a few moments left, but I will close this meeting, as I think we've come to certain conclusions on the situation. If they are going to be taken at heart and have an impact on the process, will be left to those in this room and others to determine. But I think what many of us are waiting for is exactly the discussion about what are the policy implications of this, and perhaps there will be another event here or elsewhere where that question can be answered. But obviously that requires that the understanding of the situation is also evolved. Thank you.